Hi there, my name is Allison McNally. I am a college student at Copper Mountain College, and I am studying social and behavioral sciences. Today, we're going to be discussing and looking at autism spectrum disorder and how it relates to the educational system from a sociological perspective. Let me bring up the presentation. Okay, so yes, we'll be talking about autism and how students who have autism spectrum disorder really struggle in our education system, and they also struggle later on in life. Okay, so before we go into the sociological perspectives and some of the issues, let's first look at what is autism. So according to the National Institute of Mental Health, autism spectrum disorder is a neurological and developmental disorder that affects how people interact with others, communicate, learn, and behave. Keep in mind too, these are all things that are really important in school. Learning, communication, and behavior are some of the most important aspects to being successful in the education system. Now we're going to look at the criteria that is used to make a diagnosis according to the current DSM-5. In order to make a diagnosis, somebody with autism has difficulty with communication and interaction with other people. They have restricted interests and repetitive behaviors, and they have symptoms that affect their ability to function in school, work, and other areas of life. Now, specifically that last one, it's vague a little bit, but also bearing in mind it is autism spectrum disorder. So it affects people very differently. Some normal outside issues, and some people are very low functioning. Okay, so now we're going to look at how families navigate the special education system, because it is very complicated. For parents, getting their autistic child a proper education can be extremely challenging. Families are navigating the various codes and acronyms in special education. So you have IEPs, which are individualized education plans, BIPs, behavior intervention plans, and 504 action plans. And in order to receive these types of services, families need to present to the school board a physician certification of a diagnosis. Not only that, they need to attend frequent meetings and make sure that their child is actually getting a tailor-made and individualized education, so it can be very complicated. All right, and kids with autism can be systematically isolated. Autistic students are often placed in special education classrooms, and in some cases, they're actually placed in special schools, and these can include non-public schools. Non-public schools are where children go when their behavior is so maladaptive that they cannot succeed in mainstream public education. And in most cases, these kids cannot interact with peers outside their bubble. So they are not interacting with the other students who are not in their classroom or in their school, and they are isolated. All they have is themselves and other kids who may have behavioral problems as well, and they don't have much in the way of that peer interaction for that kind of positive behavior. And these kids do show very poor outcomes later in life, especially if they're attending special schools or non-public schools. Okay, so let's go ahead and take a look at autism and the education on the micro level, the meso level, and the macro level. And specifically, we're going to look at this very harsh separation that we're seeing of special needs kids, particularly kids with autism. So I've added here this little graph. It kind of shows the differences between the micro level, the meso level, and the macro level. The micro level is a very contained system with individuals, families, relationships. At the meso level, it's kind of an in-between between the big picture and that smaller, groups of people. relationships. So this can include neighborhoods, schools, organizations, communities, and smaller groups of people. And the macro level, we're looking at very large systems, healthcare, policy, law and regulation, and that encompasses our big systemic issues. Okay, so inclusion, and we're going to look at inclusion and why we're not seeing it on the micro level. So families can feel very confused about the education system. They may not understand exactly what's going on, and they trust that their schools have the best interest of the kids at heart. Behavioral issues arise in severe cases of autism, and there is a need to protect that student and the students around them. Moving on, there's also this notion from parents that because of this difference in these social capabilities, which communication, play, just these major differences, that they should not be socializing and interacting with their peers and other children at school. And in most cases, it's really just the parents are doing their best to protect their child, and they want their child to get a good education. All right, so now we'll go ahead and take a look at lack of inclusion on the Meso level. So from the perspective of schools, kids with autism are really just a separate entity. They're different. There's them, and then the rest of the population in that school, and that's considering only children in special education classrooms in public schools. And these perceptions stem from the children's behavioral problems, social gaps, levels of communication, and levels of functioning. These differences, and combine that with the school's perspective, bring about the belief that kids with autism cannot be mixed with normal kids. And also, education inclusion has been shown to yield better outcomes, and it's still very rarely used. Okay, so lack of inclusion, of course, but now we're going to go ahead and look at the macro level. So placement with a lack of inclusion is the result of the collective ideas people have regarding kids with autism. This is a multifaceted ideology with two seemingly opposite conclusions. On one hand, the collective, people, society in general, as well as the federal government and the Department of Education, they display this notion that we have to protect these kids at all costs, even if we're not protecting them. And this protection comes at their expense. It's to their own detriment. But at the same time, these children are not meeting the same goals as their peers, and they are going to receive a subpar education as a result of these notions. We're going to move on from the lack of inclusion, and we're going to look at the medicalization of behavior associated with autism. Medicalization is defined as, quote, the process by which some aspects of human life come to be considered as medical problems, whereas before they were not considered pathological. So this is medicalization. And if we look at the statistics, we can see that the rate at which autism is diagnosed has sharply increased over recent years. According to sociologist Dr. Stephen Paulson, quote, another well-known sociological approach that may help in this regard concerns the increasing medicalization of society. This is primarily the idea that behaviors once considered common are now identified as disorders that require attention by professionals. So to kind of summarize, so these are behaviors that may be typical, that were not looked at as, behavioral problems, just behavior, and now they're being looked at as behavioral problems that need intervention. So that could possibly contribute to the increase in autism diagnosis. All right. So now we're going to go ahead and look at how this medicalization affects kids with autism spectrum disorder. So as we already mentioned, the rate at which autism has been diagnosed has increased. Dr. Paulson states also that the creation of the autism spectrum has subsumed other types of diagnosis in the past, like the more generic description, mental retardation, which was actually used as a indicator for mental health. This was an actual diagnosis at one point. Behaviors that are maladaptive, yet typical for a child's age, can be considered as criteria for needing behavioral and mental health treatment, special education, and other potentially unnecessary intervention. Okay, and I've also included here a graph. This comes from the Proceedings of the National Academy of Sciences. So this is looking at the incidence of autism, how many children, or sometimes I guess adults, are diagnosed with autism. And over here on the blue, we are looking at the number of autism publications, so what we're learning about autism. And as you can see, both lines are going up. As we learn more and more about autism, we are getting more autism diagnoses. And it's also very important to note here that this cannot have a conclusion because we have no idea what causes autism. This is being studied, but as of right now, we do not know the cause of autism. Okay. So the failure of school districts to provide for students with autism, and for this, we're going to particularly be looking at the Meso level, which is primarily school districts and schools. It's really important to remember that the education system is an institution. Students are meant to come through and get out of the system as seamlessly as possible. Another important thing to note is that insurance companies are not required to cover autism treatment. And that after 3 years of age, schools are required to provide individualized, tailored education for students with autism, and that this is very expensive for schools. As a result of this cost, schools do not provide the services and interventions that are necessary for the children to succeed. And unfortunately, it's really actually very common for schools to just refuse to recognize students' autism diagnosis and avoid having to make IEPs for children, because again, it's expensive, and schools want to avoid having that associated cost. All right. So social norms and autism. So what are social norms? Social norms are common standards within a social group regarding socially acceptable or appropriate behavior in particular social situations. So this is a quote from Dr. Zevallos in 2013 from the other sociologist. Boys have typically been diagnosed more frequently than girls, but this is because of socialization factors. In some cultures, boys are expected to run around while girls are expected to be quieter. So when children don't conform to these cultural norms, parents get worried. Nevertheless, genetics research now suggests that girls may be more protected from autism, but further research is needed. So again, it's comparing these social norms that we have in our society. What is acceptable behavior? What is not acceptable behavior? And there is differences between gender, culture. All of these things are different. So what's common for a girl, what's acceptable may not be that way for a boy, and vice versa. And I've also included a graph that shows the different types of norms. We have folkways, which is right versus rude, mores, right versus wrong, taboos, right versus forbidden, and laws, right versus illegal. All right, this is behavior modification via treatment and special education. Okay, so when we talk about autism, you are inevitably going to come to the topic of ABA, applied behavioral analysis. Applied behavioral analysis is considered the standard treatment for behaviors associated with autism spectrum disorder. ABA therapy can occur in schools, at home, or in a center. ABA is intensive and it's a very rigid form of treatment. And schools very often utilize the fundamental principles of ABA in the classrooms to reinforce desired behavior and reduce maladaptive behavior. It's also good to note that ABA is very effective and very, very controversial. And some people even call this treatment abusive. Personally, I cannot weigh in on this. As an RBT, I've worked in ABA, so I cannot be unbiased. There are numerous ABA providers, and treatment has the potential for McDonaldization, as the goal is to graduate from ABA. So when we talk about McDonaldization of ABA, we're talking about cookie cutter goals, copied and pasted from one child to the next. And all the goals are very similar. So, if you say a large corporation, they might have the same set of goals, maybe slightly different for every child. Reduce the number of tantrums, compliance, all these things, and it's the same, even though ABA is supposed to be individualized. But again, the goal is to graduate from the program. Okay, so now we are going to look at autism from the structural functional perspective. So what is the structural functional perspective? It revolves around the idea that these systems and these institutions are moving parts in order to keep stability and, most importantly, maintain order. One can argue that this is the system that is designed this way in order to help the most amount of students possible. Another argument is that some children with autism do often display behaviors that would create disorder if they were with, a large number of other children. So if a child was getting very violent, tantruming, things like that, that would create disorder in a large classroom full of children. And then lastly, a system created in this way provides kids with the opportunity for access to tailored academic education. So these kids need to be able to learn the basics of arithmetic, reading, writing, and all the other things we learn in school. And this is basically saying that, yes, these children have the right to learn these things just the way anybody else does. All right, so now that we looked at the structural functional perspective, let's go ahead and look at autism from the conflict perspective. So the conflict perspective revolves around the idea that we are in a perpetual state of conflict as we compete for resources. So it can be argued from this perspective that school districts ignore students with autism to avoid associated costs. And another aspect is that low-functioning children with autism are less likely to be employed as adults, and therefore society views them as a burden. And lastly, kids with autism are viewed kind of as a monolith, and they're not, they're one thing, they're not individual people. And as a result, they're not actually provided with a truly individualized education. Same thing, we discussed in the ABA section, it's copy paste, it's the same, or mostly the same child to child, even though that these plans are supposed to be individualized. If you were to ask me, I would tend to agree with the conflict perspective. As yes, it's very expensive to, educate a special needs child, and schools do not want to shell out that money. They just don't. Now, as far as the, less likely to be employed as adults, that's also true. But this last part, therefore society views them as burden. Yeah, I mean, they go to group homes and they don't go out much, and they just don't live, as fulfilling of a life as somebody without, severe autism would. So as far as the conflict perspective goes, I would say so. All right. So next, we are going to go ahead and look at the social outcomes for autistic adults. Social outcomes for the majority of autistic adults are poor. Approximately 50% fail to achieve independence in their living status, employment, and close relationships. A longitudinal study was conducted to demonstrate outcomes for people with autism. The study of 1,199 individuals reported that 49.6% of participants had poor outcomes regarding objective functioning. So, to be clear, objective functioning is defined as being competitively employed, having friends or romantic relationships, and living independently. And 49.6% of these participants did not reach those goals. And it's also important to note that this doesn't necessarily lead to a conclusion. We don't know why things are the way they are. Because again, more research needs to be done on this topic. There is actually not many studies done on this. So more research is needed. Okay, and over here, I have provided some statistics from Drexel University. What happened to young adults with autism between high school and their early 20s? So 36% attended post-secondary education. So among the autistic adults who are in their early 20s, only 36% went to college. Only 19% lived independently. 58% had a job for fair pay, and 74% received access to services. So ideally, we would like all of these numbers to go up. So again, back to just more research. All right, the conclusion. Children with autism and their families face a multitude of challenges when faced with the education system. These challenges include lack of inclusion, poor quality IEPs, and schools that may not identify their child as autistic. Sociological factors play into these issues and may help to identify issues in order to correct them. And these is where I got all my information, and I will also put all of this into the description of the video. Thank you for watching. So yeah, this was a really interesting something to look into, as again, I was an RBT for a long time. I worked in the education system actually for quite a while, and actually worked as in the special schools. So this was really something that I was really interesting to learn about, as it'll help me, and for parents too with special needs kids. Okay, thank you. Bye.